Hey guys, it's Sports213 here, and today we're going to be going over the top position players in fantasy football for the 2025 season, going into week 16, and in other words, after week 15. So starting off with last week's top position players, the top scoring QB from last week is Trevor Lawrence. He had 44.3 fantasy points in the Jags win against the tanking New York Jets. But Trevor Lawrence is not the only Jaguar player to score over that many fantasy points or be one of the top position players, but his college buddy and current teammate Travis Etienne is the highest scoring running back in fantasy from last week with 31.5 fantasy points. Yep, how about that? Two Jaguar players that were both college teammates at Clemson. Yep, one of these weeks they were end up as the top scoring position players each there. Yep. But for QBs, the highest scoring QB overall after 15 weeks is Josh Allen, currently sitting at 334.54 fantasy points. Yep. Josh Allen still is the only QB to surpass the 300-point mark overall this season. The next closest is Mahomes, who we will get to in a sec. Yep, the next closest is Mahomes, But now let's just go and see who the top scoring receiver is from last week, and that being Amon-Ra St. Brown. Yep, Amon-Ra St. Brown is the highest scoring receiver from last week with 41.4 fantasy points in the Lions' loss to the Rams. Yep, that game was really good. Yep, it was high scoring. Amon-Ra now is the third-ranked receiver in fantasy behind Puka and JSN. And, of course, JSN is still the highest-scoring receiver after 15 weeks. And I did forget to mention that Christian McCaffrey is still the highest-scoring running back after 15 weeks as well. Christian McCaffrey currently sitting at 344.2 fantasy points, while JSN becomes the first receiver this season to surpass the 300-point mark, currently sitting at 305.7. There are actually 5 players now this season that have surpassed the 300-point mark, so JSN being the 5th one to do that this year. But the other 2 that you don't see their names up there are Jonathan Taylor and Jahmyr Gibbs, who both of them still have a shot to become the top running back in fantasy if somehow McCaffrey doesn't do good during the last 3 weeks of the season. But there's a chance that there could be a QB that could surpass Josh Allen during these last 3 weeks of the season, as long as if Josh Allen has yet another monster game, then that's it. He's QB1 of the season. And yes, for the top scoring receiver, I think only Puka and Amon-Ra have a shot of surpassing JSN as the top scoring receiver this season. For tight ends, the highest scoring tight end in fantasy last week is Kyle Pitts. He scored 45.6 fantasy points in the Falcons win on Thursday night against the Bucs. Yep, Kyle Pitts had the best game of his career, his breakout game. He scored a hat trick in that Thursday night game. So yeah, I think we were all waiting for Kyle Pitts to have his breakout game, and he's got it. Yep. But I don't know if we're ever going to see Kyle Pitts as the top scoring tight end in fantasy for any week ever again, but who knows. But still, and of course, the top tight end this season is Trey McBride. Well, he is the highest scoring tight end after 15 weeks. But, of course, sitting at 272.1 fantasy points. And the next closest, Travis Kelce, he is, I think, around 94 points behind Trey McBride. So, yeah, Trey McBride is the only tight end this season to surpass the 200-point mark. And, yeah, and with that 94-point gap between him and Kelce, who, speaking of Kelce, he's going to get married in like a couple months or so. Yep. That 94-point gap between him and Kelce for Trey McBride. Yup, no one's going to catch up to him. No one's going to catch up to Trey McBride. And I'm going to keep saying that until we get to the final week of the season. He is locked up as the top tight end in fantasy. So, yup. Anyways, moving on to the top scoring teams, defense, and special teams. And that honor goes to the Ravens. They're the top scoring teams, defense, and special teams from last week with 20 fantasy points in their shutout win over the Bengals, which they goose-egged. Not only they goose-egged the Bengals, they eliminated them from the playoffs as well. But still, the highest scoring teams, defense, and special teams is the Seahawks teams, defense, and special teams with 165 fantasy points. The only teams, defense, and special teams that can surpass the Seahawks this season for that top spot in fantasy is the Texans teams, defense, and special teams. They're like 24 points behind. And the top kicker from last week is Jason Myers with 24 fantasy points in the Seahawks win against the Colts, who were now being led by 44-year-old Phillip Rivers. Yes, you heard that right. 44-year-old Phillip Rivers has come out of retirement to try to save the Colts season, but I don't think he is, but you may never know. It is all because of Indiana Jones getting injured, and he's out for the season, unfortunately. Yep. So hopefully Indiana Jones will be back next year. So, yep. But back to the kickers. Yep. Jason Myers scored all the Seahawks points last week in their win against the Colts. And that is good enough for Jason Myers to still be the top scoring kicker in fantasy football after 15 weeks, currently sitting at 177 fantasy points. And this is the third straight week in which the overall position leaders are the same players, the same guys, yes. I think this is like one of the longest streaks this season that for the overall position leaders that for consecutive weeks that it has been the same. So, yep. So, yeah, now we're starting to get that feeling of who really are going to be the top position players in fantasy football now that there's only a few weeks left to go in the season. Now, to go along with that, the other three players that have scored over 30 points, 30 or more fantasy points last week. Trey McBride scored 37.4 fantasy points, of course. Like I said, he's already locked up the spot as the top tight end in fantasy this season, as Trey McBride went off for those 37.4 fantasy points in the Cardinals' loss against the Texans. And then James Cook, and then in the same game, both James Cook and TreVeyon Henderson went off for 31.1 and 30.1 fantasy points respectively in that thrilling Bills-Patriots game in which the Bills won. Yep, thank God, man. Because Patriots, they are frauds, and Drake May is a bust. Speaking of QBs, yes. One notable injury to point out, yes, unfortunately, Patrick Mahomes is out for the season as he suffered a torn ACL in the Chiefs' loss against the Chargers, which eliminated them from the playoffs for the first time in over a decade. Yep. And the crazy thing about it is that Mahomes suffered a torn ACL in his 9th season, just kind of similar to Brady. Yes, both of them lost in the Super Bowl to an NFC East team in their 8 seasons. Both of them have spent only played one game during their rookie seasons as backups. And during their 9 seasons, both Brady and Mahomes tore their ACLs. Yep. Crazy, man. I mean, Mahomes, this is why he's clearly the next Brady, and the modern day Brady. I mean, we all knew it ever since like 2018 or so, in Mahomes' first season as a starter. But crazy, that kind of coincidence that both Mahomes and Brady suffered torn ACLs, season-ending injuries in their 9th seasons, while currently with having won 3 Super Bowls. So, yeah, Mahomes coming into Week 16, now that he's out for the season, he is the 2nd-ranked QB in fantasy. Now, the QBs that have a good chance of surpassing him, are going to surpass him, are Drake May, Stafford, and Dak Prescott. I know there's Jalen Hurts, who is just lurking outside the top 5, but those 4 QBs, Drake May, Stafford, Prescott, and Jalen Hurts, they're going to most likely surpass Mahomes and finish in the top 5. And Mahomes he's not even going to finish in the top 5 due to his season-ending injury, but he might not finish in the top 10 for QBs in fantasy. But we'll just have to see what happens during the last 3 weeks of the regular season. Mahomes is not the only QB that suffered a torn ACL, but unfortunately for my pack, Micah Parsons also suffered a torn ACL, and he's out for the season, which just makes me upset. Because Micah Parsons was a player that we just traded for exactly a week before the regular season started from the Cowboys. Micah Parsons is literally our defense, man. He makes our defense really good. And he's one of the reasons why we're obviously doing good. So, but I think we should be all right without him rest of the season. But I don't know about us winning the Super Bowl, because Micah Parsons is that one player that can instantly change the game for defense. And yeah, with these injuries going on, especially this season, I mean, every season is filled with injuries. Yeah, and that's the part that everybody hates about sports, basically, is when players get injured, especially if they have those players on their fantasy team. Although fantasy football only tracks offensive players, and kickers. So, yep. Here's a quote that you're all going to remember. Wait, if I can remember it. What was that quote again? Oh, yeah. Here's the quote. Football gods are jerks and injuries suck. I repeat. Football gods are jerks and injuries suck. Yup, it is true. But hopefully Micah Parsons comes back next season, and same with Mahomes. So that way for Mahomes, obviously, maybe he can have more seasons of being a top fantasy QB, one of the top fantasy QBs. And all that kind of stuff, as long as he doesn't suffer any more injuries. So yeah, there you go, guys. Yep. Those are the top position players in fantasy football 2025. Going into week 16, in other words, after week 15. Yep. Stay tuned for when I go over the top position players for fantasy football 2025 going into week 17. In other words, after week 16, as we got only 3 weeks left to go in the regular season. And yeah, after next week, the final 2 weeks will be the championship game for fantasy football for anyone that makes it there. So yeah, that's all I have to say for this, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to join the Sports Dude Nation, as I am getting closer and closer to reaching 600 subs. Hopefully I can make it there by the end of the year. And I'll see you guys later, and remember to not be a jerk during this most festive time of year.